What would actually happen if Canada became the 51st state? Canada becoming America's 51st state would not simply mean using American dollars, crossing the border without a passport, or paying lower prices at some stores. It would mean Canada would stop existing as an independent country. This remains an extremely unlikely hypothetical. Most Canadians strongly oppose annexation, and any merger would require enormous constitutional changes, negotiations with the provinces, indigenous nations, and the United States government. But suppose it somehow happened. What would actually change on day one? The first and most important change would be sovereignty. The Canadian Parliament would no longer be the highest lawmaking authority in the country. The office of Prime Minister would disappear or temporarily become part of a transitional government. The King would no longer be Canada's head of state. The American President would take that role. The United States Constitution would become the supreme law. Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms would no longer be the country's highest constitutional document, although some Canadian protections could remain temporarily during the transition. Canada would no longer control its own foreign policy, military, immigration system, or international trade negotiations. Those decisions would be made in Washington. But Canada probably could not operate as one single state. Canada has approximately 40 million people, 6 time zones, 10 provinces, 3 territories, a distinct French-speaking society in Quebec, and hundreds of indigenous nations with their own treaties and governments. If the entire country became one state, Canada would receive only 2 senators, just like every other state, despite having a population comparable to California. A more realistic arrangement would turn several provinces into separate states. Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, and Alberta could each become major American states, while smaller provinces and territories might be combined or given special status. That would completely reshape American politics. The former Canadian population could receive dozens of seats in the House of Representatives and significant influence in presidential elections. Many Canadian cities would likely support Democrats, while conservative regions in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and rural Canada could align more closely with Republicans. Canadian political parties such as the Liberals, Conservatives, New Democrats, and Bloc Québécois would probably disappear, merge into American parties, or survive only temporarily at the state level. One of the biggest visible changes would happen at the border. The Canada-United States border would become an internal boundary. Canadians and Americans could travel between places such as Toronto and Buffalo, Vancouver and Seattle, or Windsor and Detroit without passports or customs inspections. Goods would move without international tariffs, customs paperwork, or currency conversion. That could be a major benefit for businesses. Canadian companies would gain direct access to the entire American market, while workers could potentially move more freely between provinces and American states. But immigration control would shift to Washington. Canada would no longer choose its own immigration targets, refugee rules, international student policies, or temporary worker programs. American agencies would control Canada's airports, coastlines, and other external entry points. Canadians would also likely become American citizens. Canadian passports would eventually disappear and be replaced by American passports. Permanent residents would need their legal status converted into an American immigration category. The Canadian dollar would almost certainly be replaced by the US dollar. Bank accounts, salaries, mortgages, pensions, and debts would be converted at a negotiated exchange rate. The Bank of Canada would lose control over interest rates and monetary policy. Those decisions would be made by the U.S. Federal Reserve. This would eliminate exchange rate risk between Canada and the United States, but Canada would lose the ability to respond independently to problems affecting its housing market, energy sector, or economy. Taxes would also change. Canadians would file federal taxes with the Internal Revenue Service instead of the Canada Revenue Agency. Workers would pay Social Security and Medicare payroll taxes. The GST would likely disappear because the United States does not have a national sales tax, although former provinces could create their own state sales taxes. Some Canadians might pay less income or sales tax. Others could pay more through healthcare premiums, property taxes, payroll deductions, or education costs. Accounts such as RRSPs, TFSAs, and RESPs would need to be converted or protected under special transition rules. But the greatest immediate crisis would probably be healthcare. Canada's provinces currently provide publicly funded hospital and physician care. The United States relies heavily on private insurance, employer plans, Medicare, Medicaid, and the Affordable Care Act. Canadian hospitals could not suddenly begin charging patients on the first day. Millions of Canadians would not yet have American insurance. Emergency legislation would be needed to keep provincial healthcare systems operating while a new arrangement was developed. Over time, however, Canadians could face private insurance premiums, deductibles, provider networks, and higher out-of-pocket costs. Doctors, hospitals, and pharmacies would have to rebuild their billing systems, while drug prices and insurance coverage could change dramatically. Canadian pensions would face a similar problem. The Canada Pension Plan and Quebec Pension Plan would need to be merged with or operated beside American Social Security. Employment insurance, parental leave, disability benefits, and child benefits would also need to be replaced or protected. Canada's longer parental leave system would not automatically survive because the United States does not offer an equivalent universal federal program. Canadian laws and rights would also change. The Second Amendment would apply, giving people a constitutional right to possess firearms. Many Canadian gun restrictions could be challenged. The First Amendment would provide broader protection for speech, including some expression currently restricted under Canadian hate speech laws. Canada's National Criminal Code would eventually be replaced by federal and state criminal laws. The death penalty could become available for certain federal crimes, although individual states could decide whether to allow it for state offenses. Abortion, education, policing, and many environmental rules would increasingly become state-level issues. Quebec's French-language laws and civil law system would face major constitutional challenges. Indigenous treaties would be even more complicated. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities have treaties, land claims, and constitutional rights connected to the Canadian Crown. Those obligations could not simply be transferred to the United States without negotiations and likely major legal challenges. Indigenous nations could argue that neither Ottawa nor Washington had the right to transfer their lands without consent. The Canadian Armed Forces would also be absorbed into the American military. Canadian bases, ships, aircraft, and personnel would come under the U.S. Department of Defense. NORAD would no longer be a partnership between two countries because the entire continent would fall under one national command. Canadian men within certain age groups could also become subject to selective service registration, even though the United States does not currently have an active draft. Some changes would be symbolic. The maple leaf would no longer be the national flag. O Canada would no longer be the national anthem. Canada Day might continue as a regional celebration, but it would no longer represent an independent nation. Daily life would not completely change overnight. Canadians would still live in the same houses, attend the same schools, watch the same hockey teams, and work at the same businesses. But over several years, passports, taxes, healthcare, pensions, courts, military command, and political identity would all be transformed. Canada could gain complete access to the American economy, the US dollar, and the world's most powerful military. But it would lose control over immigration, foreign policy, monetary policy, national laws, and its own political future. So the real question is not whether Canadians would enjoy cheaper shopping or easier border crossings. The real question is whether those benefits would be worth the end of Canada as an independent country. Because on day one, Canada would not simply become the 51st state. Canada, as a sovereign nation, would cease to exist.